Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This is Joe Erickson with RestaurantOwner.com. Today, we're presenting the webinar, Train the Trainer, how to build world-class managers and staff in your restaurant. Today's presentation is going to be given by Anton Villado. Anton, are you with us today?
I'm here, Joe.
Fantastic. I'll tell you what, this is a really hot topic. We've got a lot of people signed up for this webinar today. In fact, they're pouring in as we speak here. Can you kind of review what we're going to be discussing today?
Absolutely, Joe. So let me just share it quickly. And we all know training is important. One of the things that we do in restaurants is we have our training in-house. We have some of our servers, our prep cooks. We have everybody kind of help out as a team, training each other. And really what today is about how to equip them to do that job well. It's about how to train trainers so that they can deliver effective training. And without that, really expecting them to do a job that they've never been trained for. So I'm excited that there's so much interest in this topic, and I'm excited to share what we have to share today with our listeners. So we're talking about how to turn your managers and select staffers into world-class trainers, right? And we know that training is the primary way that you equip, empower, and motivate employees, right? Very important. Equip, empower, motivate. Those are powerful words, which they tell us that training can have a powerful effect on your employee experience. They can have a powerful effect on your guest experience, and ultimately a powerful effect on your restaurant and really your restaurant's bottom line. This webinar is going to show you how to powerfully enhance the training that you provide by dramatically improving the capability of your managers and staff trainers, anybody who delivers training, so they can do it at the highest levels and support a culture of employee and restaurant growth in general. But before we get started on that, I want to just kind of review the structure of today's webinar. And this webinar, I'm going to break it up into just a few major components here. First, I'm going to give you an overview of how to create a training program. And then I'm going to follow that up with a walkthrough on the steps you need to perform during a single training session. So these are going to be organized around a concept. I'll introduce this in detail, but it's going to be called the 9 events of effective instruction. Very important and very helpful. And finally, I'm going to provide you with the tools and resources needed to train employees by introducing proven training techniques and best practices in this area of training trainers. Now, in terms of what you're going to learn today, let me briefly review the learning objectives of today's webinar. We're going to talk about the training cycle, what it is and why it's important. We're going to talk about those 9 events of effective instruction. I'm going to also cover characteristics of a high-quality trainer, so things you can copy and emulate to help you out and things you can instruct others to copy and emulate. We're also going to be, I'm going to cover using the Train the Trainer model in your restaurant. And I'm going to wrap it up with some best practices and cutting-edge techniques in training delivery. And I should say I'm going to actually wrap it up with a Q&A. So just so you know, we're going to have some time for Q&A at the end. So let me go ahead and get started in the meat of today's webinar. Now, before we begin talking about how to deliver training, we need to talk about how to create effective training. And so the question is, how do you create effective training? Now, there are going to be many things to consider here when you're creating a training system. And the answer to this question is going to depend on many things, like what you're training or who you're training and the outcomes that you need at the end of training. But I'll tell you, if I had to sum this up and sum up my answer into as few words as possible, I could reduce it to one word, and that would be systematic. Effective training is systematic. It's systematic in terms of design, and it's systematic in terms of delivery. Now, unfortunately, many restaurants don't invest enough time in training because I think they just don't understand the power of training. For example, right, all the different training methods available out there, right, on-the-job training is still the most popular and widely used method to train employees today, particularly in the restaurant industry. Now, I just want to be sure we're on the same page. On-the-job training, what I'm talking about is training where a current employee is assigned to train another employee. And that current employee does it by performing their job with a training observing, right? Shadowing sometimes is what we call it. Now, you don't have to answer this, but just think, how many of you on the webinar today currently use on-the-job training in your restaurant, right? If the statistics are right, then I bet many of you do. Now, I don't want to suggest that on-the-job training isn't good, right? It has many benefits, and that's why we use it. That's why I'm going to still encourage you to use it after this webinar, right? First, it's relatively low cost, right? We know training can be very expensive, thousands upon thousands of dollars. It's relatively low cost to do on-the-job training. Second, On-the-job training allows your trainees to a chance to practice while they're learning. And all of our research has shown that trainees who are given an opportunity to practice, they learn it much faster than trainees who aren't. And third, and probably most importantly, on-the-job training enhances transfer. So what do I mean by transfer? Transfer is taking what you've learned in training and applying it on the job. And I'm going to talk more about this later, but basically practice enhances transfer. So there are many benefits to on-the-job training when it's conducted systematically. But I'll tell you, all too often, on-the-job training is executed poorly because it's executed in a manner that really isn't systematic. And that's unfortunate because there's a lot of benefit to doing on-the-job training. But just think about the type of training, on-the-job training that you've seen or experienced over the years, right? I'll ask, who has been assigned to deliver that training? Is it the employee who's been taught how to train? It's probably not. Sometimes the person who's assigned to train is someone who is just scheduled for that shift, right? Without much thought about it. In other cases, someone who might be considered good at their job, but still has had little to no instruction on how to train others. Now, neither of those situations is optimal. In fact, if on-the-job training isn't systematic, you can expect a couple of things that are pretty negative to occur in training, right? You'll see bad habits passed along. And I've heard trainers who are doing on-the-job training say things like, you're supposed to do it this way, but nobody really checks, right? And when you hear those things, right, those few simple words, they can do so much to undermine your systems, your procedures, your processes, probably more important, your leadership and your restaurant culture, right? Just those few simple words. Another issue I want to draw attention to is if your training isn't systematic, then the trainer is the one who will need to create the training, right? And let's face it, if you're not training your trainers, what you're basically doing is asking employees to do a job for which they've never been trained. And you all probably know this as much as I do. In restaurants, that's always a recipe for disaster. Effective training is systematic training delivered by people who are equipped and prepared to train. So that's why I'm so excited to talk to you about how to achieve this in your restaurant. Okay, to begin, I want to briefly, and I'm going to say very briefly, I'm going to briefly talk about what constitutes an effective training system, right? They're not the focus of today's webinar. And if you take a look at our library of past webinars, you'll see I've covered the topic of how to create world-class training in another webinar. But I'm going to do a brief summary so you can see how training delivery fits into a training system, and so we're all on the same page. So a systematic approach to training is going to be cyclical, right? Training experts refer to this image that I've got on the screen here as the training cycle, and I want to briefly walk you through the steps. The training cycle begins with identifying a learning need, that is, what needs to be trained and who needs to receive that training. Often, this comes from your job description, right? Job descriptions are going to serve as a good outline of what needs to be trained. After that, you're going to develop learning objectives, right? These learning objectives are the starting point for training content, and they also serve as the starting point of your training evaluation criteria. That is, the learning objectives tell you what to train and how to determine if your training is working. Now, once you've learned what to train, you'll need to design the training program. Step 3. This includes the content, the manuals, the training scripts, the videos, the slides, whatever else you need to achieve your learning objectives. You'll also develop the criteria used to judge if the training is effective, the questions, the quizzes, the exercises, the test. Again, I'm going fast here. This is just an overview, but if you're interested in a deeper dive, exploring these concepts a little more deeply, then please check out the training webinar that we have available on restaurantowner.com. So the next step in the cycle is to deliver the training program. And this is what we're going to discuss today. This is the focus of today's webinar. So I'm going to come back to this because this is what we're going to talk about for the bulk of today's webinar. Finally, you need to evaluate your training program. And as I said earlier, your learning objectives inform both your content and how you evaluate training. This is an important step that I'll tell you far too many overlook. It's important because a purposeful and systematic evaluation provides you with the guidance you need to continually improve your training. And I describe this as a cyclical process because once you've evaluated your training, you can use that information to revise the whole system, your training needs, your learning objectives, right? Your content and the criteria by which you evaluate training, all those things are going to be evaluated once again. And this approach to training is adaptable. It follows a plan that produces a comprehensive training program. Because it incorporates feedback, it adapts to a changing environment. And let's face it, right? In today's world, restaurants who don't adapt, well, they're the ones who end up closing shop. So this adaptability is a very important piece. Now that's the training cycle. I said I was going to go through that quickly, and I know that's fast, but this is not the focus of today's webinar, and we do have a webinar based on that, but that's the training cycle. Now what I want to do is really get into the meat of our webinar today and give you some practical guidance on how to deliver training. I want to introduce a framework that you can use to deliver training this afternoon, or that you can share with your managers and select staff, anybody who delivers training, so they can deliver effective training. In fact, everyone in your restaurant, I'm going to suggest this, everyone in your restaurant who trains other employees, they should know what I'm about to share with you in this webinar. Now, there are many ways to organize this practical guidance, but the one method that I've found to be very effective, easy to follow, it's simple to teach, it's a method that is based upon the work of training experts. They've identified what are called the 9 events of effective instruction. Now, these 9 events are used worldwide by training professionals to guide their training delivery and to train others. So I'm just going to walk you through these. The first event is to gain attention, right? Gain attention. Now, this is more than just saying, hey, everybody, listen up, we're about to start training, right? The goal is to grab the attention of learners and to get them interested in the content. Now, you might be asking yourself, how do you do this? Well, if you take a look at the server training manual templates that we have available in the resource library, you'll see it on the first page in the very first paragraph, right? So I'm going to read you this little snippet. As a server, you will set the stage and have a direct impact on each guest's experience. You will determine whether each guest feels welcome, appreciated, and well cared for. We will provide you with the training you need to be successful. See, that simple little statement at the beginning, this is attention grabbing. It tells the trainee that as a server, their role is important. They have an important role on the team, and that this training that we're about to give them is what they need to be successful. And this is far more than, hey, pay attention, right? This really is a sell, and that's where you want to begin your training, gaining attention. So that's one example of how to gain attention, right? It's an attention-grabbing opening. Another way to gain attention is to ask questions, right? Maybe 1 or 2 that focuses the trainee on the training. So let's use server training again, right? You could simply ask the question, briefly describe the best and worst service experience, or the best and worst service you've received while dining in a restaurant. Now, once everybody has finished sharing their experiences, you could wrap it up by saying, well, those were certainly some interesting examples of what to do and what not to do. What we're going to do today is to give you the tools you need to be someone's ideal service experience. So these are 2 very simple but practical ways to grab attention and get your training started on the right foot. Very simple, very practical, easy to do. If you don't do them, though, training isn't as effective. The next event that will help you deliver effective training is to present the learning objectives. Now, what this does is it gives the trainee a framework and an understanding of the topics that are going to be included and those that are not. I like to describe the benefit of sharing the learning objectives like this, right? So just imagine with me, right? You and I are going to go grab some dinner, and you're not familiar with the area or the restaurant to where we're going to go, so I'll navigate and you drive. So just imagine with me, as we set out, I begin giving you directions, right? I say things like, make a left turn at the traffic light, we're driving, turn right at the next light, take the entrance ramp onto the interstate. Now we're on the interstate. A couple of miles go by and you begin to wonder, where are we exiting soon, right? Another few minutes go by and you start thinking, how far is this restaurant? A few more miles go by and you're convinced something is wrong. On this trip, you probably spend the whole time wondering what's coming next, distracted, not noticing what's going on around you, pretty much a very distracted trip. Now imagine a different situation. Imagine how different it would be if I gave you an overview of the route before we started. Something like, okay, we're going to go to a restaurant that's 10 miles away. We're going to head to the interstate, take that for like 9 miles, and exit at Main Street. And the restaurant's going to be at the corner of Wharton and Main. It'll be obvious. That little overview, that overview of the route changes how you experience the journey. And like that overview, knowing what you're going to learn and the topics you'll cover give the trainee an idea of the journey they're about to take. It provides a framework for the lesson. It helps them to focus on what they need to learn. They won't be distracted by trying to figure out what's coming next, what's going to be included, what's not going to be included in training. Now, a lot of people ask, is there any special technique to presenting the learning objectives? And my answer is no. It's fine to simply review them at the beginning of the lesson. You don't have to get fancy or creative. You can just state the learning objectives as they've been written down. And again, it's a simple concept that has a significant consequence because it prepares the trainees to learn. So, once you've presented the learning objectives, you'll next want to stimulate the recall of prior learning. And what this is you want to get the trainees thinking about what they already know, what they've already learned, and how that information applies to what they're about to learn. So doing this helps to make sense of what the trainees are about to learn. It reminds them of what's come before, and it allows them to pick up where they left off. Doing this also improves their ability to remember. As trainees practice remembering something, they tend to become better at remembering that information in the future. Not only that, but it also serves to show trainees the logical progression of learning. In my experience, showing trainees that what they're about to learn builds upon things that they've already learned, well, it helps them to build confidence. It helps the trainees to see that they're not starting from square one. Now, you can do this in several ways. You can ask questions about what they've learned or experienced. And of course, the types of questions you're going to ask will differ depending on where you are in the training program. At the beginning, you'll need to ask questions about prior life experiences or prior work experiences. For example, when training servers, you could ask about concepts they learned during onboarding. You could ask, what's the mission of the restaurant? Now, doing that helps also tie in the mission to what they're about to learn. Of course, if the trainee has already completed several modules of job training, you could simply ask about something that's been covered in a previous module. Remember, the goal is to get them thinking about what they've already learned, practice remembering that, and help them to understand what they're about to learn and how that will build upon what they already know. So next, you'll present the content. Now, if you've taken the time to understand the training needs and use that information to develop the learning objectives and use that to assemble the training content, then delivering the training should be rather straightforward. But training is more than just standing up and reading from a script. So let me share with you how to effectively present training. Now, I've organized this section of the webinar around characteristics of effective training delivery. And as a trainer, these are characteristics you need to incorporate into the way you deliver training. These are things you just need to do or copy. First, effective training delivery is characterized by clarity. Clarity is just what it sounds like. It refers to how understandable the presentation and material is to the trainee. Now, the challenge is not in the concept, right? We all know what clarity means. It's how you put it in practice. So how do you boost your clarity as a trainer, right? How do you ensure that you're clear? I'll tell you, organization and preparation, they're the key. Those are the keys. If your training is well thought out and well organized from the beginning, it's going to be far clearer and far more effective than training that isn't. If you're making it up as you go along, it'll be choppy, it'll be disorganized, it won't be created in a logical progression. What you want to do, though, is be so clear that the trainee could easily outline the training. And if you follow a well thought out training program, you almost can't help to be clear. So, effective training delivery is also characterized by variety. And by variety, this is really how flexible the trainer is when it comes to presenting material and asking questions. Your trainers, what they need to do is they need to include a mix of activities. And training that includes live instruction and reading is more effective than training that only includes reading. So you want to include a variety of methods when you are training, including reading and instructing, demonstrating. Lots of restaurants will incorporate role play or simulations, if you want to call it that. Whatever you're capable of incorporating into your training program to enhance variety, you should do it. Effective trainers also create variety by asking different types of questions, like facts questions, right? This would be, where's the first aid station? Or process questions, how do you split a ticket? Right? That requires you to go through steps or talk about steps. Both of these types of questions, they cause trainees to think about what they're learning in different ways, and asking questions helps the learners to judge whether they're learning. So it's really important to do that. Effective trainers are also task-oriented, right? A task-oriented trainer recognizes what needs to be learned in a given period of time, organizes the material around those learning objectives, and works hard to meet those objectives, even when there are distractions. So trainers who are task-oriented are focused more on covering all of the relevant material than on the trainee's enjoyment of the training. Now, that sounds odd. That doesn't mean that we ignore what the trainees think about the training. What it means is that the trainer's primary focus must be on delivering the training that meets learning objectives. That's why it's very important to have those learning objectives specified. Effective trainers also engage trainees in the learning process. At the most basic level, this could be done by adjusting the pace of training based on the trainee's ability. If a trainee learns quickly, then a trainer should move quickly. And if a trainee is having difficulty with a particular task or concept, then an effective trainer would slow down and adjust the pace of training for that trainee. Now, you can also build engagement by allowing the trainee to help direct their learning. And one way to do this is to offer some additional activities or exercises if the trainees find that they need or if they want extra practice. And you'd be surprised at how many will want to practice something once they understand how important it is to their job. Finally, an effective trainer will work to encourage and support trainee success. Now, what you want your trainers to do, is to convey to the trainee that they are capable of learning the material. And within reason, you want to provide the trainee with everything that they need to succeed. So what does this look like? Well, first, it means that you organize the training. And when you do, you make sure that you begin with the easy material first. If you begin with the easiest material, you'll build the trainee's belief that they can do it. You can also encourage and support trainee success by organizing the material into manageable chunks or modules. So oftentimes, the material you're presenting, it has obvious breaks, and you can break those up into modules. So for example, training an employee how to answer phones can be taught separately from entering an order into the POS system, for example. But when there aren't obvious breaks, you need to create modules to give the trainee an opportunity to take a break and absorb what they've learned. So most training content should have obvious breaks. But if it doesn't, then I'm going to recommend just some guidelines here. And start with 25-minute sessions and follow this with a 5-minute break. Once you've reached 4 hours of these 25 minutes of training material and 5 minutes off, then break for 30 minutes after 4 hours. After that 30-minute break, do another 4 hours, and then you've got an 8-hour day. Now, as you become more familiar with the material and you get a better feel for how quickly or slowly you need to move through the training, you can adjust the schedule. But if you don't know where to begin, this is a good point to begin, right? Just start with a 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off schedule. So those are the characteristics of a high-quality trainer. And since we've covered those, I want to go ahead and get back to our framework of the 9 events. As you present the learning content, you'll also want to provide learning guidance. And what this means is setting up the trainee to learn without becoming overwhelmed. The best way to do this is to organize your modules into 4 stages: the tell, show, explain, and practice. So imagine you're going to train someone to wash glassware. What you want to do is you want to begin by telling them what they're going to learn, right? We're going to cover glassware, and you can tell them about some of the details that you're going to show. Then what you want to do is you want to show them. And you want to do it at full speed. So maybe you wash 10 pieces of glassware. And this gives them not only an idea of the task, but what it'll look like once they've learned the job. Of course, they're not going to be able to go as fast as you are, but they will have a good idea of how fast they will need to go. Then what you want to do is do it again. But you're going to explain what you're doing. And because you're explaining the process, it's going to be much slower this time. But you use this time to explain what isn't obvious. Then you let the trainee try it themselves and get some practice. And as they do, you can remind and correct them as they go along. But you do want them to have some hands-on practice. Another way to do this, or tricks or tips that speed learning, and these can serve as useful tools on the job. These can be as simple as instructing servers to mentally number the seats at the table starting at the same place every time and number the seats around the table by going clockwise, right? Just very simple tricks that speed and aid learning. And if your trainers are incorporating these tips and tricks into their training, they're far more effective. And now as you build training and continue to develop your training program over time, exercises, activities, tricks, and tips, these will become obvious. Now, we've all heard the saying that practice makes perfect, and there's some truth to that. So after presenting the content and guidance, what you want to do is to provide an opportunity to practice by eliciting performance. We often take this for granted, but practice enhances training in several ways. First, practice helps trainees to internalize the new knowledge and skills that they've learned. And by practicing what they've learned, trainees experience firsthand the various nuances and little details that can only be experienced by doing. So for example, writing down orders in a clockwise fashion, it's a good advice for server training. But by practicing, you're going to find out that sometimes guests don't want to place their orders in a clockwise manner, right? By doing, you learn how to make adjustments. We learn by doing. Practice also allows you, the trainer, to determine whether the trainee is learning, right? I'm going to come back to this point a bit later because this has to do with assessing performance and feedback. Now, finally, practice can help a trainee overcome anxiety about performing a new task, right? Doing something for the first time, especially in training, can be rather intimidating for some people. But by doing it, by building in practice, you allow trainees to overcome their anxiety in a training environment, right? I would much rather have a trainee practice how to deal with an entree that's sent back in a training session than during the lunch or dinner rush. Now again, your training content will guide you in terms of when and what to have trainees practice, but you must allow trainees a chance, an opportunity to practice. The next event concerns feedback. Feedback is critical to learning. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with feedback, so I don't want to spend too much time on this topic, but I do want to briefly review the characteristics of effective feedback, particularly feedback that's in a training environment, right? One, it's immediate. Don't ever delay feedback. Give it as soon as you are able. Usually, I like to train managers to praise in public and correct in private. Now, this is true for day-to-day operations, but in training, praise and correction, they both need to be immediate. So managers and trainers get a pass on this praise in public, correct in private rule of mine. Effective feedback is also specific. You should be precise when giving feedback. Don't say you need to look more professional, right? Instead, you want to say something like, you need to look the guests in the eyes and stand up straight when you're in the dining room. That's very specific. Likewise, it's instructive. Right? So when giving feedback, try to avoid telling the trainee what they did wrong and focus on providing guidance on what you'd like them to do, on how they could do it correctly. Telling a trainee to look the guests in the eyes and stand up straight when they're in the dining room is more informative and instructive than saying you don't look customers in the eyes and you slouch. Also, it's relevant to learning objectives. If you can tie your feedback to a learning objective, then great. If not, then you need to rethink why you're even giving the feedback. Feedback, it's also actionable. In other words, the feedback must address something that the trainee can control or correct. So telling a server they had too many guests in their section, well, they probably can't help that. But not asking for help to deal with the rush, now that's something they can control. So that's effective feedback. Also, it's not to be avoided. If you don't provide feedback, the response or behavior you see in training may be repeated on the job. And if you don't correct incorrect responses, what you're doing is you're really telling trainees that it's okay. So it's not to be avoided. Now, earlier we discussed eliciting performance, right? Getting them to perform, getting trainees to perform. And when you elicit performance, it provides you with the opportunity to assess performance. And by assessing performance, you're able to determine whether the training is meeting the learning objectives. Remember, an effective training system is cyclical, and part of that cycle is assessing the effectiveness of your training program and training delivery so that you can make adjustments. And now you could assess performance through quizzes or questions or exercises. You might assess performance through a role play where the trainee plays the role of the server and you play the role of a guest. Whatever the method, effective trainers are constantly assessing performance along the way, and they make adjustments as necessary. So assess performance. Now, the final event is enhancing retention and transfer. Retention is simply remembering what you're learning in training. Transfer is taking what you learned and using it on the job. So basically, we're talking about remembering and applying. Remembering what was trained, what was learned, and applying it to the job. Now, that's actually really important when you think about it, right? That is what training is all about. Because it doesn't matter if a trainee excels during training. I mean, how many times have we witnessed somebody do a great job in training and bomb when they get on the job, right? So if they can't apply what they've learned on the job, then the training is essentially worthless in my mind. So transfer is really the true purpose of training. And there are a few key ways that we can enhance retention and transfer, a few of which we've already mentioned, right? So the few that we've already talked about are stimulate recall, provide learning guidance, and elicit performance. We've already covered these, but these all help the trainees to internalize what they've learned and apply it to the job. Now, what I haven't addressed yet or introduced yet is the idea of identical elements. It sounds very complex. It's not, right? Basically, what this says is that the closer the training environment is to the job environment, then the greater the retention and transfer. So what do we do with this? Train servers in the dining room. Right? Have them use the materials, the supplies that they would use while on the job. Have them use the POS system. Have them handle the trays and glassware. This is one of the primary benefits of job training. So whenever you're able, use the actual tools, supplies, and materials that are used on the job in your training. And, so long as it's safe and cost effective to do so. Now, another way to enhance retention and transfer is to conduct refresher training. Refresher training goes by all sorts of names in the training industry. Sometimes we call it continuing education credits, recertification, and the like. But whatever the name, refresher training helps employees remember what they've already learned, which in turn equips them to use that on the job. So don't fall into the trap of thinking that training is a one-time event, right? Really, training is a career-long event. Now, one final way to enhance retention and transfer is through job aids. Job aids are simple things that remind employees about facts or procedures. So one job aid that everyone is familiar with is a sign, right? It's a very simple reminder of a procedure that must be done. Now, these signs have other goals too, no doubt, but one is to serve as a reminder to employees. Here's another example of a job aid. This is a picture of a Domino's Pizza kitchen. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the pictures that Domino's has on their walls to remind staff of how to build their pizzas using these pictures, right? These are simple, easy to use guides that help staff remember what they've learned. There's no reason why you want to not use these whenever you can. Another example is a checklist, right? I was using the opening and closing procedures earlier as an example, and those procedures are perfect for a checklist. And that checklist helps an employee remember what tasks need to be performed at the beginning and end of every shift. In fact, as you've probably noticed in your downloads, I've provided a checklist of events to include in a training session. And this simple tool can be used to guide you to guide how to prepare employees to deliver training, as well as serve as a reminder as they are preparing to deliver training, which brings us to the train the trainer model. So you can use this to remind everybody. But that, like I said, that brings us to the train the trainer model. What is the train the trainer model? The train the trainer model is on-the-job training focused on those who are delivering training. So you see, what I've shared in this webinar so far is the framework and content that you would cover to train a manager or a select staff member to train another employee. With the 9 events of effective instruction, you now have the tools to begin equipping, empowering, and motivating others to serve as trainers. Right? Practically, I'm going to suggest this. Take what you've learned and pair it with your current training. Right? Once you've delivered training a few times, right? Once you've gone through some training session and delivered it yourself, right? Then invite someone who you'd like to train to be a trainer, right, to view the training. Someone who's qualified to train others, then have them attend a training session that you deliver. But instead of having your observer focus on the training content, right? So if you're teaching how to wash glassware, instead of having them focus on washing glassware, ask them to focus on the way you organize and deliver training. They can then use that training events checklist as an outline, right, as they begin they begin to follow you as you train. And this is how you simply and practically implement the train the trainer model in your restaurant. You deliver on the job training that is focused on those who train, invite a qualified employee to observe, have them focus on the delivery of the training, not on the content, and use the training session checklist as a guide. So we've covered so far the 9 events of effective instruction, including characteristics of effective training delivery. And I now want to spend our remaining time on some additional best practices, some things that'll help you out as you deliver training. And to organize these, I'm going to draw upon adult learning concepts. Adult learning concepts. And by adults, I mean 18-year-olds and above. So basically, the people you're likely to be training. And this is very different, you'll see, from the way we were taught as kids in primary or secondary school and elementary school and high school. It's going to be very different. So as I go through these, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of trainees. And as we cover them, think about whether this is true for you as a learner. So, when learning, what do adults like? First, adults like to know why they are learning something. I know this is often used to describe millennials, right? People say millennials want to know why. But actually, if you look at it, it's been around for decades, and it's true for most adults. So, to improve your training, what you want to do is spend a few minutes talking about the why. Explain to trainees why they are learning the material. Doing so often serves to gain the attention of trainees, and it motivates them to learn. So let me give you some ideas how to put this into practice. You could explain that the training equips them to meet the restaurant's mission and goals. Or you could emphasize that the training program is designed to help them perform at maximum levels, and that job performance is not only how they're able to earn promotions and raises and tips, but it also helps the restaurant, which in turn helps them, right? Whatever it is, however you decide to do it, take some time to explain why they are in training. Second, adults have a need to be self-directed. That is, adults like to be involved in the planning and evaluation of their learning and instruction. Now, we've discussed this already. What it means is that you can provide additional opportunities when trainees want more practice, right? If you're going to use exercises, try to create some easy ones and some challenging ones, and vary them based on how the trainees are progressing. Next, adults bring work-related and life experiences, some positive and some negative, to the training table. This is different from kids. They're starting off fresh, but adults, they've probably had some life experiences. They've probably had some work experience. So first, take the time to learn the background and experience of your trainees. Right? Ask yourself, has the trainee ever held a job for the job for which they've been hired? Right? Have they done this job before? Or is this their first restaurant job ever? Is this their first job ever? Knowing the answers to these questions will help you gauge the knowledge and experience that each trainee brings to the table. Also, recognize that people learn from successful and failed experiences, right? So try to incorporate learning from failures and successes during training. Right? If you do a role play and someone bombs the exercise, don't overlook the opportunity to use it as a teaching moment. Now, of course, you don't want to embarrass the trainee, but oftentimes failures, and I think many of you will agree, they provide a much richer learning experience than successes. So encourage trainees to make mistakes, to experiment and to really push themselves, and encourage them to learn from those mistakes. So train with both successes and failures. Fourth, adults typically approach learning with a problem-centered focus. So that is, adult learning is problem-centered rather than content-centered. So adults are more likely to say, I need to learn about how to motivate employees because I'm a manager and the employees I supervise, they're not motivated, right? I need to motivate them. They're more likely to say that than something like, motivation is a management topic and I manage people, so why not? Right? That's just not the way adults operate. Therefore, to enhance learning, tie your training to problems. Explain to trainees how this training is going to solve their problems, and they'll be motivated to learn. Also, adults are interested in learning about subjects that have an immediate relevance to their job or personal life. So make the connection between training and immediate relevance. So just simply explain how training can help them. Finally, adults are motivated to learn by both extrinsic and intrinsic motivators. Now, what are these? Well, extrinsic motivators are things like raises and promotions, things that are external to the person, that happen to them. Intrinsic motivators, well, those are things that are internal, like a desire to be successful or a strong work ethic or a desire to learn and improve, right? So there are two routes to motivate your employees. There are two ways to motivate your trainees to excel. Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear that, I'm not thinking of which one to use. I'm thinking of how do we use both. So I would encourage you to use both. So first, you connect the dots between training and extrinsic motivators. Training leads to performance. Performance leads to promotions and raises and tips and restaurant profitability and job stability and security, right? Those are very simple comments. Those are very, very simple statements, but they just connect the dots. Second, you want to connect the dots between training and internal motivators, like how training is focused on a problem they have and it meets an immediate and relevant need. You see, you can motivate trainees to learn through a variety of means, all of which are typically already in place. You just have to connect the dots with the trainee. So, to wrap this up, training is a powerful tool in your personnel arsenal, in your human resource management arsenal. And although many restaurants overlook the power of training by not training their trainers, you don't have to make the same mistake as so many others. So using the tools provided on restaurantowner.com, you have in your toolkit the resources necessary to turn your managers and select staffers into world-class trainers. I now want to wrap up by taking some time to answer any of your questions, maybe discuss some things further. But before I do that, I have one question of my own for you today. Based on today's webinar, what are you going to do differently in your restaurant? Now, I'd love to hear from each and every one of you. You can input your responses into the questions field, and afterward, I'd be happy to take questions as time allows. And if we run out of time, please feel free to post your questions in our discussion forum, right? I'm on there frequently, and I'll try to answer whatever questions you may have today and in the forum. And if you do it in the forum, you're likely to hear from other members. So it's a great, great opportunity. I want to encourage you to do that if we don't get to your question today. So, Joe, any questions for today?
Well, there are a couple questions, Anton. And first, just let me say, great content, very well explained. If people incorporated the 9 steps of learning and the checklist, the training checklist that you provided, I think just incorporating those things into